Hey, good morning, afternoon, or evening. Welcome to this UNIDIR event on options for international cooperation under Article 10 of the Biological Weapons Convention. My name is James Revill. I'm head of the WMD and Space Programs at UNIDIR, and I'm delighted to be able to moderate today's panel discussion. The Ninth Review Conference of the Biological Weapons Convention has been postponed until later this year, or potentially later still. But when it does take place, provide an important opportunity to advance the Biological Weapons Convention. To do this, progress in Article 10 will be important. Article 10 has long been recognized as significant. It's also been salient, even divisive in discussion at past review conferences. Over the course of the pandemic, so since the last review conference, we have seen cooperation in public health, but also competition for public health resources. And in the first committee, we can see wider interests in the idea of peaceful purposes, including resolution on this topic. These factors may heighten attention to Article 10 at the Ninth Review Conference. And with this in mind, we've sought to provide some further thinking on options for the implementation of Article 10 in advance of the review conference. This draws from a recent UNIDIR report on this topic. You can find the link in the chat, so there should be a link for downloading that. I should point out in this report, we make no claim to have solved issues related to Article 10, but what we have done is bring together a diverse collection of authors from around the world to present some new ideas and explore ideas from some earlier proposals, such as the NAM Action Plan. Some of these are summarized in the table, which should be coming on your screen shortly. I don't plan to go into detail on these. Each of these is available and discussed in the report. So we're happy to discuss more of these at this event and of course beyond as well. More importantly for today though, I'm delighted that some of the authors have been able to join us on the panel today. They are all speaking in their personal capacity. And before I go into introducing some of the questions, a couple of practical details. I should note at the outset that this event is being recorded and will be made available on the UNIDIR YouTube channel in the coming days. The format is a moderated discussion, which I will begin with some opening questions before leading into a sort of Q&A, question and answer session. I would encourage you all to please use the Q&A function to submit written questions. This should be located at the bottom in the middle of the Zoom window you have in front of you. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Don't feel you need to wait for the speakers to complete. We'll welcome those at any point. And the other thing I'd like to add, if you want me to include your name, please add this into the text. Otherwise, we'll keep the questions anonymous. I will try to get to as many questions as possible, but we make no guarantees because we have limited time at today's event. So with that in mind, I'll move now to the panel. Firstly, I'm delighted to welcome Mayra Ameneiros, who is a research associate at King's College London in the Department of War Studies. She is also an Innovation Fellow at PandemicTech and Director of Strategic Engagement and Development at Biopreparedness International and Deputy Coordinator at NextGen. She's got a decade of experience in different areas of biochemistry and scientific research and is a member of various national and international organizations working on issues of biosafety, biorisk, biosecurity, and global health security. So thank you for joining us. The second speaker we have is Richard Lennane, who is a consultant on multilateral disarmament issues. He has extensive experience as a former Australian diplomat who was involved in the ad hoc group negotiations, as well as working for the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs between 2001 and 2013. This included a role as head of the BWC Implementation Support Unit from its creation in 2007. Richard, thank you for joining us as well on the panel. Third speaker, we have Anastasia Malygina, who is an associate professor at St. Petersburg State University, where she teaches courses on WMD non-proliferation, arms control, and military innovation. Since 2017, she's been hosting international workshops on strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention regime, and she has published widely on this and disarmament diplomacy and international arms control. Welcome to you, Anastasia. And finally, we have Amanda Moodie, who is Director of the Programme for Emerging Leaders and a Policy Fellow at the National Defense University's WMD Center in the US. The work of the center focuses on international legal regimes that regulate the proliferation of chemical and biological weapons. And she regularly serves as a member of the US delegation to BWC meetings. In this particular event, though, I should make clear she's speaking in her personal capacity. Thank you all for joining us at this event. And perhaps if we could begin with some discussion on some of the overall challenges faced in terms of international cooperation. And perhaps if I could turn to you first, Richard. Your chapter in the report talks about systemic problems related to international cooperation. It's something else which is raised by Ines Mohammed in her section as well. I wonder, could you elaborate a little bit on this? Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and thanks to UNIDIR for creating this paper and giving us all an opportunity to weigh in on Article 10, which, as everyone knows, is quite a prickly topic and has been the cause of much controversy in the history of the BWC, as well as will be something many states parties are looking at the Ninth Review Conference. So you mentioned systemic problems, and in my chapter, I'm looking at something which I've gradually sort of come to appreciate in the many years I've been working on the convention, and that is that although there's a lot of debate about, what's wrong with cooperation and whose fault it is that Article 10 doesn't work better and so on, I think, and as I set out in my paper, my chapter, that this is, it's not really anybody's fault. And I don't think, there's any bad faith involved in this. These systemic problems have actually emerged kind of from patterns of everyone trying to do the right thing in terms of the various articles of the convention, but the result, in fact, is rather unfortunate. And that is, there is a good deal of hampering. As you know, Article 10 says that the BWC must be implemented in a way that avoids hampering the economic and technological development of states parties and avoids hampering international cooperation and the peaceful uses of biology and biotechnology. And I really don't think that any state party is out there trying to hamper anyone's development or trying to hamper international cooperation. I mean, nobody does that. Nevertheless, I think there is a pattern of interference or hampering or problems with cooperation emerging from a kind of the way that export controls are implemented. And again, this is not because people are trying to stop, for example, developing countries getting access to diagnostic reagents or to needed equipment and so on. It's just that the way that many states parties implement their Article 3 obligations results in a bit of a dampening effect. And I'm afraid I can't give you any sort of empirical or convincing evidence about this. This is really my own impression as a sort of collection of experiences while I was working for the Implementation Support Unit. But I traveled a lot around the world to many states parties, participated in a lot of workshops and meetings with people responsible for implementing the convention nationally, people responsible for public health, for preparedness and disease surveillance and so on. And this was a very common complaint in developing countries, especially that they have consistent troubles in accessing the stuff they need to do their jobs. Troubles getting hold of diagnostic reagents, troubles getting hold of equipment, troubles getting hold of all kinds of stuff. And the reason that I try to explain in my chapter is that often it's just too much trouble. I think many Western countries can correctly say, look, we have very few export denials. So, we grant 99% of biological related export license applications. Refusals are vanishingly rare. What's the problem? There's no hampering here. But I think what happens in practice is that many supplying companies, exporting companies, find it too much trouble to apply for an export license, particularly for small markets, small orders. It's just not commercially worth the bureaucratic hassle. I think secondly, they will not even apply or bother if they think there's any chance at all that the license might be declined or refused. They want to be absolutely sure that they're not wasting their time and money. And the third factor, I think, is that because of very sensible rules and regulations and so on biosecurity, biosafety and transport safety, transport regulations, a lot of freight companies who are the ones shipping this equipment and materials from the supplying countries to the receiving countries, they sometimes just won't carry it, or their conditions are very onerous, or it's very expensive. And this forms, again, just a practical barrier. It's nobody's fault exactly, but the effect is that a large number, I think, of countries are finding it difficult to access needed supplies in a timely manner and in a cost-effective manner. So the result is a lot of good intentions, but some, I think, quite serious systemic problems. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought this to the fore. It's shown just how important timely supplies are for biosecurity, for disease control, disease surveillance, disease response. And this is both a public health question and it's a security question. So it's absolutely something that states parties, in my view, states parties of the convention should be looking at as a high priority. That we need to do something to tackle these systemic problems without getting into the finger pointing of, well, it's your fault, or this country's not doing what they should. I think on the whole, all states parties are acting in good faith, but I think they need to look a bit more carefully at what's really happening. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. I think it's a really useful opener pointing to some of these systemic problems, and we will come back to you shortly for your solution to address this priority problem. Perhaps now I could turn to you, Amanda. In your section, you ask whether there is agreement on exactly what constitutes the fulfillment of a state's party's obligation under Article 10. This is also a point raised by Dr. Gunnar Jeremias as well in the report. I wonder if you could elaborate on how is this an issue and sort of expand a little bit on this. The floor is yours, Amanda.
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. And thanks to UNIDIR for pulling this report together and also having us all here to speak today about some of these issues. So I think when we look at Article 10, we're really looking at two parts. So you've got the obligation to facilitate the exchange of equipment and materials and information, and then you've got the obligation not to hamper that exchange. And so I want to kind of start with the first part and the disagreements around that. So what exactly does it mean to try to facilitate this exchange? I think when we talk about facilitating, it's understood within that you're not just not standing in the way of states that are trying to use biology for peaceful purposes, but you're actively assisting them in doing so. But I think that's kind of where the disagreement comes in, is what exactly does that assistance look like? And I think part of the definitional issue here is that a lot of this language kind of gets extrapolated from the NPT in particular. So if we go back and we look at the negotiating history of the BWC, a lot of this language in Article 10 directly copies the language that's in the NPT's Article 4, which stipulates that all states parties will have full access to peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But the central bargain of the NPT is really quite different from the bargain in the BWC. So in the NPT, states that join the treaty are giving up their right to nuclear weapons, and in exchange, they're being given access to international cooperation that they otherwise wouldn't have. In the BWC, I think the bargain is a little bit different, that states are giving up biological weapons, and in exchange, it's not just that they're getting cooperation, they're also getting the knowledge and the understanding that their neighbors have also given up those weapons. So I think that may be a little bit where some of this definitional confusion comes from. But I think the other part of this problem is that there's such a wide range of different activities that can fall under the heading of assistance and cooperation. And you can have things that are very directly tied to the obligations of the convention, say, providing training for law enforcement officials who might be looking for biological weapons proliferation within a particular territory. That's pretty clearly directly tied to the objectives of the BWC. Then you can have some types of assistance that might focus on issues related to biological weapons and the deliberate use of biology as a weapon, but could also have really important benefits for naturally occurring outbreaks. Surveillance is something that I would put in that category. This is something that, on the surface might be more directly tied to natural disease outbreaks, but it also has really important implications for how we understand the convention. And then there's this third category of assistance that I think really is more related to natural disease outbreaks. And we've started to see more and more reporting on those types of activities that fall under the heading of Article 10. And these might be things like assistance that's provided to a country during a natural disease outbreak, like the assistance that was provided to African countries during the Ebola outbreak in 2014. Those are things that tend to get reported on under Article 10 as well. I don't actually think that that is an issue personally. I think that it makes sense to include some of those types of conversations because, you know, if there is a biological weapons attack, your capacity is going to be affected by the way that you're dealing with natural disease outbreaks. So I think even there you can draw a link between these things. But I think that what we are seeing in some of the BWC discussions in the meetings of experts and elsewhere over the last few years is a disagreement about that third category in particular, about which activities are pertinent to be included when countries talk about the assistance that they're providing under Article 10. And there are some states that really have the view that this should only be activities that are directly connected to the objectives of the BWC, and others that think that there can be a really wide range of activities that support those objectives, and we can take a very broad definition here. And then there's the second part of Article 10 that deals with this question of how do you implement the convention without hampering economic or technological development. And I think this ties in a little bit to what Richard was just saying, that maybe there's also some disagreement about what constitutes hampering and how you go about that while also implementing your obligations under Article 3 and other parts of the convention. So I think this is why there's really disagreement on what exactly Article 10 obligates states to do and what kinds of assistance we're talking about. And I think that can really contribute to disagreements about whether a particular state is in compliance with that obligation.
Great, thank you, Amanda. I think it's really useful on the challenges and definitional issues. I'm also struck by the point on the MPT psychological political sort of overlay, which I think links nicely with the question for Anastasia. But before I proceed with that, if I could encourage you, if you do have questions, please do feel free to submit these to the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screens. But moving to the next question, Anastasia, in your contribution, you suggest Article 10 could provide a way of keeping the convention up to date with evolving challenges and actually building linkages to things like sustainable development. I wonder whether you'd be able to elaborate a little on these linkages. Please, the floor's yours.
Thank you, James. Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention has been existing for more than 4.5 decades, and since its entrance into force, the scope of security problems has significantly broadened. So the problem of biosecurity has become broader than was envisaged by the convention's architects. And the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention was designed as an instrument of disarmament, but to my mind, it should not lose its effectiveness in the 21st century when the problems of public health, food safety, biodiversity have become as pressing as ever. So when I was thinking about the international and scientific cooperation in the context of Article 10 of the BWC, I was focusing on the word peaceful purposes. And I thought that the 2030 sustainable development goals and targets may be used as a frame for thinking and elaborating more on these peaceful purposes. There are a lot of interlinkages among the 17 goals mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goal Roadmap. So to my mind, Article 10 of the BWC may serve as an umbrella for developing innovative scientific and administrative solutions to meet these goals and targets. In this regard, states parties to the BWC may adopt a kind of a roadmap that will connect Article 10 with the Convention on Biological Diversity, Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. So international scientific and technical cooperation in the context of Article 10 of the BWC should address economic, social, and ecological considerations of different regions of the world. And I guess that when assessing what is needed and when trying to match needs and offers, the Sustainable Development Goals may be used as a foundation for such assessment. A process to review cooperation may spot the gaps and overlaps in the programs undertaken by different international organizations and other actors. And if we look at annual reports on sustainable development goals, we will not see now mentioning of biological and toxin weapons convention implementation support unit or UNIDIR contributions, but I guess there is something to add to that activities. The goals connected with education, inclusiveness, peace, they all are relevant to that goals and targets mentioned in the SDG plan. So I guess that there might be some review that will help to identify how states parties cooperation in the context of Article 10 may contribute to sustainable development goals. But this is not the only thing that I was thinking about when preparing my paper. I guess that there is another issue that deserves attention. Reducing risk of bioterrorism against people, plants and animals and all types of water environment fits in the context of Article 10 cooperation to my mind. And the diplomatic dialogue aimed at developing and adopting a convention on the suppression of acts of chemical and biological terrorism should continue. However, the lack of progress in this field must not prevent the states parties to the BWC from cooperating to protect hospitals, laboratories, other facilities that may pose a potential biohazard against acts of terrorism, including cyber terrorism. So again, I guess here there is much to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. The last point on cyber bio is quite an interesting area, that sort of intersection. There's something I'd like to explore further. I also take your point on the SDGs, and I think there's perhaps much that could be learned from the progress and discussion, the annual reports that are discussed in the SDG context, including things like the technology transfer mechanism as well. So thank you for raising that. Now, if I could turn to Mayra. Mayra, could you tell us a little bit about your experience as a scientist and some of the challenges of international cooperation that you faced from your perspective? Please, the floor is yours.
Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me today. It's such an honor to be in this panel session and having this discussion today. I described several challenges of international cooperation for scientists like me on my chapter of the report, but I think that as a summary of these ideas, it would be good to highlight some of the next few points. First, we all know that new technologies are incredibly accessible and decentralized. And as scientists, we frequently see that as a benefit, which of course it is, but we must question all the risks that this presupposes for global health security. So what are we doing for addressing this? The first thing we should know is that scientists need to be aware of this risk while working on the laboratory or doing scientific research. And for that, we need to enhance biosecurity education and awareness raising. The base for everything for me is education, and I identify a role for Article 10 in fostering cooperation between universities on issues such as bioethics, science diplomacy, and biosecurity. Scientists need to be trained to open their eyes, change the way they think, and see clearly those gaps, those security gaps while working on the lab. So what a better way to engage them from the grassroots level, engaging young scientists from an early steps in their careers. So another point is, another challenge that I identify is the disconnection between the scientific community and the policy or diplomatic community. Often our work ends up on a scientific publication, or it remains on a paper, and we could do so much more with this knowledge which can benefit individuals, the environment, organizations, or nations if properly applied. Another challenge is that science diplomacy is not a concrete path for many of us. So there's a need to foster a global community of scientists for policy or involved in diplomacy. And finally, for achieving this, we should bring leaders into the discussion to foster interaction between scientists and diplomats at different levels. It's important for governments and international organizations to create opportunities and forums for scientists to connect with the world of diplomacy.
Great, thank you, Mayra. I'll come back to you for some specific concrete ideas on how this could proceed in due course, but thank you. I just want to go through a second round of questions. I'd remind everybody the Q&A is open. Please do feel free to submit questions to the panelists. In the meantime, I'll perhaps go through and try to look at some more concrete ways to enhance Article 10. Perhaps if I could begin with you, Anastasia, I wonder whether you could sort of provide some examples of how Article 10 could be implemented to address economic, social, ecological concerns that you mentioned. I mean, are there sort of ideas that you have for doing this? Please, the floor's yours, Anastasia.
Thank you, James. Let me start with social concerns and social needs. The COVID pandemic revealed how vulnerable some groups in society are. And I can suggest only one practical project that may be applied jointly by states parties and businesses and local communities. So that again will be an example that fits perfectly, to my mind, to the Sustainable Development Goal implementation. Taking into consideration lessons learned from the current pandemic, obviously there is a need to rearrange the ways how hospitals, schools, care homes for elderly and other types of social infrastructure buildings are organized. And there is a need for constructing air cleaning systems, developing new air cleaning systems that will be adopted for the current challenges and the upcoming challenges connected with different types of communicable diseases. So there is no access to these quite advanced technologies in many states, and here I guess states parties may facilitate the cooperation between the academia and businesses to help them and motivate them find for economically effective and affordable and achievable solutions. And then, of course, there will be a need to attract funding for such programs, but I guess that might fit properly to Article 10 of the BWC, and there will be such a bridge between SDG and Article 10 cooperation. Another similar example, how to make public transport, public spaces, industrial enterprises, especially in the developing world, more safe place to work, taking into consideration the challenges of different types of communicable diseases. So again, that is the social and economic problem that definitely is not the main priority for many countries, but there is the need for addressing this issue, and the lessons learned from current pandemic proves that more attention should be paid for such tasks. So here again, I guess there is a need for collaboration between private businesses, big transnational corporations, innovative scientific institutions, and of course those who will provide funding. It may be some UN fund or a philanthropic organization. So such type of program may be realized in the context of Article 10 of the BWC, I guess. That are two examples regarding social and partially economic needs. If talking about other examples, education, access to education, developing different types of online courses, courses to train the trainers to improve national public health systems, to improve ability of states parties to BWC collect and reprocess statistics and then share these statistics. Creating different online platforms to give opportunity for specialists in local communities, get consultations from other countries or from the capitals of their countries, so that the knowledge may be shared and may be managed more properly, and practices to address public health emergencies may be adopted more smoothly to evolving challenges. One more problem is the problem of communication, and I guess it's also the social problem that most of the documents that are circulated among the states parties to BWC are circulated in English, or in the best case, they are available in 6 UN languages. In some situations, the governments do not have enough resources to translate and analyze such documents. So obviously there might be some innovative solution and maybe technological solution to provide translation services to improve communication and improve integration of specialists to the world global community of life scientists. So that are only a few examples, and of course they are more numerous. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. I think your point on social and economic problems reminds me of something that seems particularly important, which is developing relations between academia and industry on the one hand, and that sort of BWC related space on the other. And I think there are some steps from the past that could be helpful there. I now want to turn to Richard, if I may. You talk about the idea of establishing some sort of cooperation entity. I think at one point you used the term cooperation committee, and this is something which has been around for some time. It's part of the NAM action plan. But I wonder whether you could talk a little bit through us about what could it do and how you would see this working. And please, the floor is yours, Richard.
Thanks, Jamie. Yes, I mean, it's an idea that goes way back, and it's been very controversial. I mean, this is something that was, I think, first proposed in the ad hoc group negotiations on the protocol. The problem with it, firstly, in terms of what such an entity could do, let's call it a committee, or it could be like a working group. Whether I suggest a few possibilities in my chapter. I don't think that's so important. What's important is having a clear mandate and clear terms of reference. What is this entity charged with doing? How will it improve the implementation of Article 10? And I think for me, a first step would be to look at some of these systemic problems that I raised at the beginning. As I said, I don't have the evidence. I don't think there's been any sort of comprehensive survey of these kinds of problems. And that would be a very good place to start, because that information is needed. It's a natural function for a multilateral body to gather information from its membership, to analyze that information, and then perhaps to look at developing recommendations or ideas for how, if these problems are there, which I'm pretty sure they are, how big they are, what are the dimensions, the factors involved, and what could be done about it, either by the convention membership as a whole, or by individual states parties, or by other organizations and other actors working separately or collectively. There are, of course, other things such an entity could do, and some of the ideas that the other panelists have raised, Mayra and Anastasia in particular, about all kinds of areas where cooperation and opportunities for cooperation assistance could be improved, specific ideas. But I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about some of the obstacles here. The reason this idea has not got anywhere in the 20 or 30 years since it's been around is that it's very politically contentious. And as I describe in my chapter, I think the reason for this is the debate tends to be occupied by the extremities. And this is not at all to diminish or dismiss the concerns of those countries who are very vocal on this. Obviously, for example, for Cuba, the US embargo and sanctions are a very pressing national concern. And whatever you think of the rights and wrongs of the situation, it's natural that Cuba is going to come to BWC meetings and complain about that. And I think the other natural thing is that Western countries have a fear that their export control decisions are going to be hauled up before some sort of international tribunal and overturned. Which is quite natural. They don't want anything like that. It's hard to see how such a thing would work anyway. But these sort of concerns have really captured the debate on a cooperation committee or cooperation entity, and that's very unfortunate because there are 183 states parties to the BWC, and perhaps 7 of them have been heavily involved in this debate, and it's leaving a whole lot of states parties and their interests neglected. So I think we need to really take a look at that middle weight of interests and needs in the large number of states parties, and put aside the very difficult political points. We don't dismiss them. We acknowledge that these need to be dealt with and aired and discussed. Hopefully one day resolved. But in the meantime, there's a lot that a cooperation committee can do if everyone agrees to focus on the realistic, achievable aims that we could give it. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. I think that's really helpful. You mentioned Mayra before, and I'm going to turn to you now, Mayra. If you could elaborate some practical examples of community building among scientists that could be taken forward in the BWC through a cooperation entity or otherwise. Please, Mayra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James. Yes, I think there are some practical examples of community building among scientists, and I described several examples, but one model for international collaboration and community building, and talking also from my experience as a participant, is the EU's Biosecurity Initiative, and created after the Biosecurity Diplomacy Workshop for Young Scientists from the Global South that is organized for the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. This is a great example of how we strengthen a regional biosecurity network in the Global South and international cooperation for the peaceful uses of biology. The workshop focused on these gaps addressed at the beginning of the session: multilateral disarmament, diplomacy for scientists, and ways to enhance and promote biosecurity. Another practical example is the associate program for the organization of the provision of chemical weapons, the OPCW. This model could be adapted to achieve a more systematic process for building next generation capacity in the BWC. However, I always think that we still need to give more space to women in STEAM careers. And for that, there is a great example called the Women in Chemistry Symposium and Training Program. That is from the OPCW again, and that could be translated to the BWC under the Article 10. And finally, there are examples in the NGO sector for bridging science and diplomacy, such as the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator. And these were kind of some concrete examples of how to foster scientific community. However, I think it's not enough to create just networks that maybe in the future can disappear. So what we need is to focus on building long-term bonds between scientists and diplomats from the BWC state parties. The creation of a scientific advisory group can be an option and a solution for this definite connection between both worlds. This should consist on experts in biosecurity related subjects serving in a personal capacity with the aim of fostering assistance and cooperation through their specialized advice in scientific and technological matters. Two examples of these can be used for the BWC. One is the Scientific Advisory Board of the OPCWB, and other one is the Scientific Advisory Group on the Origins of the Novel Pathogens, that is from the World Health Organization. They created this group the scientific group after the COVID-19 pandemic. BWC states parties could consider further supporting this sort of exercise to foster a better informed cohort of next generation researchers, as well as building research networks, partnerships, and academies. Utilizing Article 10 of the BWC can be an option for obtaining tools, strengthen networks between scientists and diplomats, building long-term bonds that will be very useful with the challenges that we will keep facing in the future, and just engage to co-create better solutions for a better world.
Great, thank you very much, Mayra. I'm conscious there's some questions starting to come in, but please do continue to send those in, and I will get to them very shortly. Indeed, perhaps with your indulgence, Amanda, there's a question which perhaps you could take here. In your contribution to the report, you talk further about developing the reporting system under Article 10, as well as the idea of a voluntary fund. I wonder whether you could elaborate on these a little, particularly on the Article 10 reporting, the number of submissions, and do you think there'd be value to standardizing that, or how would we encourage more submissions there? Please, the floor is yours, Amanda.
Sure. So I think one of the issues that we kind of have to confront in these Article 10 conversations is what data we have about what states are actually doing at the international level, and what kinds of assistance would actually be valuable. One of the things that makes this really complicated is that there is this huge range of activities being undertaken in the international cooperation space. And a lot of those activities are being undertaken or financed by entities other than the government. This could be, academia or industry or others. That doesn't necessarily mean that those are activities that are fulfilling the Article 10 obligation for governments to provide those assistance, but those activities are going on and we need to know about them. And so if the goal of this reporting system that we've developed where states are submitting information is to help us figure out where the gaps are, we have to know what kind of assistance is already out there. Assistance and capacity building programs don't usually start from scratch. They're really designed to build on existing activities. And so we have to know what those activities are. So that's kind of the fundamental point behind having this reporting system. And I think you're right that we have really struggled with actually getting states to submit those reports. I think that there's a really nice graphic in my article that demonstrates that, at best, we've got 6 or so reports of these reports being submitted each year. That's not great. And I mean, in fairness, not every state submits a report every year, and some states decide to submit together. But still, that number should be a whole lot higher. We see this issue in other conventions as well, right? So in the human rights area, only about 18% of states are actually fully compliant with their reporting obligations. And I think that a big part of this is probably just reporting fatigue, that states have to submit so many of these things, and so often there is overlap, and it's not always necessarily clear what they're supposed to submit under one treaty versus a different one, that I think sometimes it just gets overwhelming for a government that is expected to produce reports for all of these different international institutions. So I think one thing that could help is having a really clear understanding of what the information that they're submitting is going to be used for. And that means that we actually need a system that's designed to feed in the information that states are providing to help identify gaps where further assistance would be necessary. So that means, right now, states submit these reports, the United States reads them. I don't know how many other countries actually do. And we sort of try to use those to figure out where we can channel assistance and where that might be helpful. But a more systematic process to try to make sure that that data that states are submitting is actually being analyzed and is actually going to help to fill those gaps. It seems to me that's sort of the most valuable contribution that a reporting system like this can make. And so I think if states know that their reports are actually going to fulfill some purpose, that might make them more inclined to actually submit them. In terms of the voluntary fund idea, again, this isn't something that's new. This is something that we see in other treaties. So the International Atomic Energy Agency has a technical cooperation fund that's used to implement technical cooperation projects that are proposed by IAEA member states. Those get funded by extra budgetary contributions. The Anti-Personnel Mine Convention says that states parties can provide assistance either bilaterally or through the treaty system, or they can contribute to a voluntary trust fund for assistance. So that model has worked well in other treaty contexts. And so I think the idea here would be to set up a new fund to support projects to strengthen international cooperation in the peaceful use of biological science in order to address the threat of natural and deliberately caused disease. So not every country is necessarily going to have the capacity to set up an assistance program. Not every country is going to want to do the research into what gaps are necessary and where can we potentially contribute something that's going to be useful. But if they have the option of paying into a fund, that can kind of distribute that problem a little bit. And they can make a financial contribution, and then that funding can be used to develop either national or regional projects that can be enormously valuable. So the idea behind the reporting fund is really to kind of, the cooperation fund is really to kind of distribute this issue a little bit.
Great. Thank you very much, Amanda. I've got starting to get a couple of questions being submitted into the Q&A function here. And with your indulgence, I'll try and spread these out a little bit. But we have a question which I'll put to you, Anastasia, shortly on traditional and non-traditional security threats. And then a couple of questions related to the ISU and institutional role here. I'll open these out to everybody, but perhaps if I could start with you, Anastasia, on the question on traditional and non-traditional security threats. And specifically, what is the right balance between these two, and it's in inverted quotation marks here, extremes to strike for BWC efforts, given the evolution of the conceptualization of securities in the modern day? I welcome your thoughts on that, Anastasia, and then any others. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James. I do not have answer what is the proper balance, but I guess that there must be a balance. And I agree that the BWC and other disarmament agreements, they suffer some kind of identity crisis now. BWC, of course, is a state-centric agreement. However, states and governments alone cannot tackle all the security issues, because the security issues are really complicated and they are so rapidly evolving that no government possesses all the resources that are needed, including intellectual resources. So first of all, the scope of actors who may contribute to solving the security issues has expanded. And of course, this should be taken into consideration. And I guess that BWC can be easily adopted to the changing context by easily. Of course, there are political impediments and diplomatic impediments, but technically it can be done through introducing different types of advisory boards, for instance, and institutionally strengthening the implementation support unit, for instance. But I here must mention that although the protocol on verification has not been adopted, the discussion should continue, and all that I say does not exclude the need to continue diplomatic dialogue regarding the verification protocol to the BWC. So the scope of actors who may contribute to solving the security problems, that is the first thing. The second thing, the importance of the BWC. In current security environment, the importance, political importance of BWC has increased, and we all need to change approaches to how we report on BWC related events. And there must be improvement in interaction between the expert community and the reporters who currently usually report on international relations and security issues in media. There should be improvement in communication and cooperation between the governments and businesses. So when BWC was developed and entered into force, the concepts of responsible science or responsible business hardly existed. But now they have become a part and parcel of how we think about security and security-related consequences of different types of innovations. So this is another way how we can adapt the BWC to the evolving security context. Without changing the letter of the BWC, we can and should, I guess, adopt the BWC to the security challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Anastasia. I think it's one of those areas where there's actually, within the BWC and through its convening capacity, there's actually been quite a lot of already done in terms of education engagement, and that includes work by yourself and other panelists and many others, which I think is worth recognising as well. I'm conscious we have a series of questions which link to institutional support related topics, and I have three here. I'll put these firstly to you, Richard, but then open it out to all of the panelists to see what they think. But to go through some of these, has the ISU devoted resources to facilitate multilateral exchange and Article 10 implementation? That's one. Then there are two questions about basic steps to institutionalizing Article 10 implementation within the ISU. Or part of the second question, do you think a first step, a mechanism could be created to have a committee on the enhancement of cooperation assistance, drawing on the AP Mind-Bend Treaty? So I'll start off with those three, which is probably enough to put to you to start with. But I welcome any thoughts from yourself, Richard, and then others on the panel. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks to those who've in the audience who've contributed the questions. They're very thoughtful and thought-provoking, and but one of them made me smile. It's the one I was saying, knowing how the BWC makes decisions. What are the basic first steps? That's really a big part of the problem, is how the BWC makes decisions. And none of this is conceptually very complicated. Institutional support, giving the ISU a more specific role, giving the ISU the resources, human resources and financial resources to actually do something more concrete, as an obvious step. Yeah, first steps, well, you decide to set up a committee. You could even do it the real multilateral way and establish a committee to elaborate the steps necessary to create the bigger committee. But I think what's really needed here is a bit of leadership and commitment from among the states parties to push this forward. Really, there's any number of ways of setting it up. There's any number of ways the ISU could be configured to do more and to work more effectively on Article 10. And I don't think it's really worth spending a lot of time developing elaborate plans and proposals until you've got some pretty solid political and financial commitment. I'm sorry to be blunt, but states parties like to talk big and come to the review conference with lots of grand plans, but when it comes down to, well, who's going to pay for it and the final decisions, they all get cold feet. We've seen this several times. I understand it. I've been a public servant too, but if you want to see real progress, real action on implementation of Article 10, you want to see better structures, more effective work, really make a difference to what's going on. You're going to have to be ready to take some decisions, to put aside some of your pet concerns, and be ready to stump up some cash. So yeah, by all means, come with proposals for a committee, come with proposals for a bigger ISU or a specific mission for the ISU. But if you're not prepared to back them up politically and to really fight for them at the review conference, it's just not going to happen. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. I think the financial point is important as well. My understanding is there's no core funds for these sorts of activities, so facilitation, training, capacity building, but it's done through voluntary contributions as and when these are available, which is also challenging. We have another institution related question, but it's noted that in the past, states parties requested the UN Secretary General include improving institutional mechanisms for the exchange of equipment for peaceful purposes on the agenda of a relevant UN body. body. Is that something which anybody in the panel thinks would be useful to revisit? Would it be worth getting or sort of tasking the ISU to reach out to various international organizations that could be relevant? And it's really an open question to anybody. I don't know whether anybody wants to take the floor on that particular question. I can't see anybody. Okay. We've also got a couple of, I'll give you a bit of time to process that, but if anybody does want to take the floor, please do let me know and just shout up. I can't see you all, unfortunately, so please let me know. And then we have another question related to what can we learn from Article 11 of the Chemical Weapons Convention as well, and how could we draw upon ideas there? And I think, Mayra, you touched upon some of these as well. Any takers for that question?
Yes, I think that, and I will actually talk a little bit about what the first question was about, like that with the BWC was experiencing somewhat like an identity crisis of the conceptualization of security. And I think that security issues are changing all the time. What we identify as a security concept and as a threat to security. I'm more specifically talking about biosecurity. I think we will continue to emerge in the future a lot of risks. And so what I think is something that I already talked about, an advisory board, a scientific advisory board connecting scientists with diplomats could be something that could be helpful with these constant changes that we will keep suffering in the future, because as as different technologies emerge, I think that's something that we should be addressing with these connections. And I think, talking about the OPCW, those mechanisms and those training courses and education that we talk about are very important as an example that the BWC can just take and adapt to keep, training scientists about these issues and to keep enhancing this connection with this community.
Okay. Thank you, Mayra. Did anybody else from the panel wish to take the floor to provide any question responses or any final comments? I'm conscious of the time, so we'll wrap up shortly. But if I think, Amanda, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jamie. I wanted to come back on that question about including some of these discussions on the agenda of a relevant UN body. The issue that I see here is these discussions are on the agenda of a relevant UN body. I mean, we have a meeting of experts in the current intersessional process that is specifically designed to address some of these Article 10 issues. And I think that if there are proposals that can help us to sort of improve some of those institutional mechanisms, even if there's some overlap with some of these other bodies, I absolutely think it would be helpful to bring in representatives from some of those organizations, WTO or UNIDIR, for example, into the BWC context to talk about where that overlap might be. But I think it's important to remember that, the solution may not be trying to set up more fora to continue this conversation in other places. The solution is to have states kind of bring those creative solutions to the table. And I think Richard's point earlier about we're going to have to put some resources toward this problem is incredibly important, because, we can continue this conversation in other places, but how is that going to be different from the current discussions that we're having in the context of MX1, for example? It's really not necessarily going to be that different unless you can say, let's bring in other actors, let's try to get some new thinking on the table here. And ultimately, let's figure out a way to resource this problem, to actually put some time and some money toward some of these solutions. I think in the sort of post-pandemic period, we have a very limited window of opportunity where we might actually be able to make progress on some of these issues. I think there's a lot more attention to the BWC at this point than there has been in the last couple of decades. So I'm optimistic that this may be our moment to kind of make progress on some of this. But the only way to do that is to actually have states come up with solutions, not necessarily to sort of outsource that to another forum.
Thanks, Amanda. I think that's a really good point, worth reiterating this limited window of opportunity, and it really does emphasize the importance of making the most of the time for the review conference, preparing and having discussion in advance. I want to offer the floor to Richard, Anastasia and Mayra for any sort of concluding comments. Perhaps if I can begin with you, Richard. We are slightly over time, but we'll finish shortly. I hope people can bear with us. But Richard, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I can be very brief because Amanda just said most of what I was going to say. Thanks, Amanda. It was really also just to chime in on Anastasia's earlier answer about the changing concepts of security and broadening, how broad do we go in stretching out what the BWC is supposed to be covering. And Amanda's points just now are very pertinent to that. We shouldn't be trying to outsource it. So how much do we bring in? And I think the one lesson I learned from my time working in the ISU is you can't fix the BWC by fixing the BWC. It's going to have to be outward facing. And I would like to see states parties perhaps being a little bit more open and flexible about, not enforcing the borders of the mandate quite so strictly and being a bit more open to bringing in other issues into their discussions within the BWC. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Richard. And now over to you, Anastasia, please. The floor is yours.
One more thing just to add to what my excellent core panelists have already said. I guess the BWC community is still very small, and we are existing in a small bubble and exchanging the ideas, and we know each other. So I guess there is the way to improve things if the spread of word about the BWC will go broader. When I talk to my colleagues among academia in social science and life science, most of them do not know about BWC yet, do not care about the BWC. I guess that is the task for the upcoming future, because sometimes solutions, quite practical solutions and quite cheap solutions, are already on the table. It's the matter of interdisciplinary interaction and cross-cutting issue approach. So I guess sometimes there are really overlaps between different programs, and there are opportunities to use the resources, including intellectual resources, more properly and more efficiently. So I think that such initiatives like publishing the report and making the public discussion and presentation initiated by UNIDIR contribute to spreading the word about the BWC and reminding scientists and decision makers about the importance of these areas. So I guess here, the more developed in detailed strategies of communicating to local communities, to different types of stakeholders, should be also taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. And if I could turn now to you, Mayra, for a final word to you, please.
Yes, I think that all the colleagues today addressed many things. And I think, as Richard said, it's very important flexibility. If we, if state parties are not flexible with these new additions of scientific advisory boards, of committees, of experts, I think that can be difficult to at least start improving these things and see in the future all the changes we are going to be and the threats we are going to be addressing. So that's something very important, to be flexible. And also everything related with the financial issues. I think that the BWC really needs resources for doing all of these things. So financial issues is something that is very important. And actually the personnel related with ISU, I think that the implementation support unit, of course, it's always having very few people to address all of these things, and we need more personnel over there. And as Anastasia said, I think that's, for me, it's very important being a scientist, seeing how important it is for us to know more things about biosecurity, about the BWC. We don't know anything about that. And if you talk with your colleagues and your peers, you will see that just maybe what they think that the BWC is, because I'm talking, this is an example of a colleague that someday say, look, you are just talking about how to develop a biological weapon. How is that possible? That is a convention for that. It was no, it's just actually the opposite. So I think that is showing that we don't know and we don't have any idea of these biosecurity, biological weapons, and how important it is for us to train scientists, to connect with them, and to open their eyes about the risk that the things that they are doing and how they are working with all of these emerging technologies, and how important it is to learn about this, because if they address and they see the gaps that security concerns that the things what they are working, I feel it's going to be easier for us to communicate and to identify these security threats in the future.
Okay. Thank you, Mayra, and indeed thank you to all the panelists for your contribution, as well as the other authors to the report. The link is available in the chat, it's on the website, so please do feel free to go and have a look and read that. I'd also like to express my thanks to the UNIDIR team that produced this event, particularly my colleague Maria Garzan-Maceda, who has co-edited the report and co-authored one of the chapters with me. And thank you, not least, to you in the audience for joining us for this event. If you do have feedback or if you have suggestions for other events that you think we could do in relation to the BWC, please do let us know. We are keen to, where possible and useful, continue to stimulate discussion around this important convention. So please do get in touch if you have ideas. You could also explore previous publications and materials that we have linked to compliance enforcement and the BWC more specifically. These are also available on our website. For now, though, it just remains for me to thank you all again and wish you a good day, night, or afternoon or morning, wherever this finds you. Thank you all.